The old radio crackled to life as Betty reached across her kitchen counter to turn up the volume. She had been making her morning coffee when the weather alert broke through the usual country music station. The meteorologist's voice carried a serious tone she hadn't heard in years. This is a severe weather warning for all of northern Montana. We're looking at what could be the worst blizzard in over 2 decades. Winds up to 70 miles per hour, temperatures dropping to negative 20 degrees, and snowfall expected to reach 4 feet in some areas. Betty set down her coffee mug and walked to the kitchen window. The sky looked angry, with dark gray clouds rolling in from the west like a heavy blanket being pulled across the horizon. She had lived in this farmhouse for 37 years, and she knew how to read Montana weather. This storm was going to be bad. At 58, Betty had seen plenty of harsh winters, but something about this one felt different. Maybe it was because she was alone now. Her husband, Tom, had always been the one to check the generator and make sure they had enough firewood stacked. He used to joke that Mother Nature never scared him because he had Betty, the toughest nurse in 3 counties, by his side. 3 years had passed since his heart attack, and Betty still caught herself setting 2 coffee cups in the morning sometimes. The house felt too big now, too quiet. Her daughter lived in California and called every Sunday, always asking when Betty was going to move somewhere warmer, somewhere closer to family. But this farm was her home. Tom was buried in the little cemetery just 2 miles down the road, and she wasn't ready to leave him behind. The phone rang, interrupting her thoughts. She knew it would be her son calling from Denver. "Mom, are you watching the weather? They're saying this storm is going to be massive. Maybe you should come stay with the Johnsons in town until it passes." Betty smiled despite herself. "David, I've lived through more storms than you've had birthdays. I'll be just fine. But Mom, what if the power goes out? What if something happens, and we can't get to you? Then I'll handle it like I always do. I've got enough food for 2 weeks, the generator works fine, and I know how to keep warm. Stop worrying about your old mother." After she hung up, Betty walked through her house making mental notes. She had been a nurse for over 30 years before retiring, and old habits died hard. She always prepared for emergencies, always had a plan. The pantry was well stocked, the first aid kit was fully supplied, and she had enough medication to last a month if needed. She pulled on her heavy coat and boots to check on the animals. The chickens were already acting nervous, clustering together in their coop. Animals always knew when bad weather was coming. She made sure they had extra feed and water, then walked to the barn to check on her 2 horses, Thunder and Grace. They seemed restless too, pacing in their stalls. "Easy now," she whispered, stroking Thunder's neck. "We've been through worse than this together." But had they really? As Betty looked out at the darkening sky, she felt a chill that had nothing to do with the dropping temperature. The wind was picking up, making the old barn creak and groan. She hurried back to the house to bring in more firewood. By noon, the first snowflakes began to fall. They were big, wet flakes that stuck to everything they touched. Betty stood at her living room window, watching them gather on the fence posts and tree branches. It was actually beautiful, she had to admit. There was something peaceful about watching snow fall when you were warm and safe inside. She made herself a sandwich for lunch and listened to more weather updates. The storm was moving faster than expected, what they thought would hit in them. Evening was now scheduled to arrive by mid-afternoon. Betty felt that familiar tightness in her chest that came with years of nursing experience. When things moved faster than expected, it usually meant trouble. The wind picked up around 2 o'clock and the gentle snowfall turned into something more serious. Betty could barely see the barn from her kitchen window now. She turned on every light in the house and made sure her flashlights were within easy reach. The generator was fueled up and ready to go if the power failed. She tried to read a book to pass the time, but found herself looking out the window every few minutes. The snow was coming down sideways now, driven by wind that howled around the corners of the house. This was definitely going to be one of those storms people talked about for years afterward. Around 4 o'clock, Betty heard a sound that made her heart race. It was the sharp crack of a tree branch breaking, followed by a thud that shook the house. She grabbed her flashlight and peered out the front door. A large branch from the old oak tree had fallen across her driveway, but thankfully it hadn't. hit the house or the power lines. That's when she noticed something else. There were tire tracks in the snow leading from the main road toward the back of her property. Fresh tracks, barely visible now as the wind filled them in with new snow. Someone had driven off the road recently. Betty's nursing instincts kicked in immediately. In 30 years of emergency medicine, she had learned to trust her gut feelings. Those tracks meant someone might be in trouble, and in weather like this, trouble could quickly become life-threatening. She bundled up in her warmest clothes, grabbed her medical bag out of habit, and fought her way through the wind and snow, toward where the tracks led. The cold bit at her face, and she had to stop several times to catch her breath. The tracks were almost completely covered now, but she could still make out the faint depression in the snow. Following the tracks became harder as the storm intensified. Betty had to use her flashlight even though it was only late afternoon. The world had turned into a swirling white chaos where she could barely see 5 feet in front of her. She was starting to think she should turn back when she spotted something dark ahead. It was a small car, nearly buried in snow that had drifted against it. The windows were fogged up, but Betty could make out movement inside. Her heart began to pound as she fought her way closer. Someone was definitely in there, and they had been there long enough for the car to become almost completely buried. Betty reached the driver's side window and knocked on the glass. The movement inside became more frantic, and she could hear muffled voices. Through the fog on the window, she could see a young woman's face, pale and frightened. The woman was saying something, but Betty couldn't hear her over the wind. The car door was frozen shut, but Betty had dealt with stuck doors before. She used the handle of her flashlight to chip away the ice, then threw her full weight against the door. It opened with a groan, and a wave of cold air rushed out of the car that was somehow even colder than the air outside. That's when Betty saw them clearly. A young woman, probably in her early 20s, holding a baby wrapped in blankets. Both of them were shivering violently, and Betty could see immediately that they were in serious danger. The baby's lips had a blue tint that made Betty's blood run cold. She had seen hypothermia before, and she knew they didn't have much time. Without hesitation, Betty reached into the car. "We need to get you both inside right now," she shouted over the wind. "Can you walk?" The young woman nodded, but Betty could see her legs were shaking as she tried to stand. The storm seemed to grow even stronger as Betty helped them out of the car, as if nature itself was fighting against their rescue. But Betty had made it through worse things than bad weather, and she wasn't about to let a storm win now. Betty's heart pounded as she looked into the car at the young woman and baby. The woman's lips were moving, but her words came out in shaky whispers that barely made sense. The baby in her arms wasn't crying anymore, which scared Betty more than if she had been screaming. "What's your name, honey?" Betty shouted over the howling wind, reaching her hands toward them. "Lisa," the young woman managed to say through chattering teeth. "This is Rose. Please, she's so cold. I don't think she's breathing right." Betty's nursing instincts took over completely. She could see the baby's chest moving, but it was shallow and too slow. The little girl's skin had that pale bluish tint that meant hypothermia was setting in fast. They had minutes, maybe less, before this became a life-or-death situation. "Lisa, I need you to listen to me very carefully," Betty said, keeping her voice calm and steady despite the panic rising in her chest. "We're going to get you both to my house right now. It's not far, but I need you to stay with me. Can you walk?" Lisa nodded, but when she tried to stand up, her legs buckled. She had been sitting in that freezing car for hours, and her body wasn't responding the way it should. Betty caught her before she fell into the snow. "Okay, change of plans," Betty said. "I'm going to carry the baby and you're going to lean on me. We're going to take this one step at a time." Betty carefully took baby Rose from Lisa's arms. The child was so still it terrified her, but she could feel the faint flutter of a heartbeat against her chest. The baby's clothes were damp from the cold, and her tiny hands felt like ice. "Come on, sweetheart," Betty whispered to the baby as she tucked her inside her own coat, trying to share her body heat. "You're going to be okay. We're going to get you warmed up." The walk back to the house felt like it took forever. The wind pushed against them with every step, and the snow was so thick Betty could barely see where she was going. Lisa stumbled several times and Betty had to stop to help her up while still protecting the baby from the cold. "I can't do this," Lisa gasped, falling to her knees in the snow. "I can't make it." "Yes, you can," Betty said firmly, pulling Lisa back to her feet. "Your baby needs you to make it. I need you to make it. We're almost there." When they finally reached the farmhouse, Betty's hands were shaking so badly she could barely get the key in the lock. Once inside, she immediately went into emergency mode. She had Lisa sit on the couch while she rushed to get blankets from the bedroom closet. "We need to warm you both up, but we have to do it slowly," Betty explained as she wrapped Lisa in warm blankets. "Too much heat too fast can be dangerous." Betty took baby Rose to the kitchen and turned on the tap, testing the water temperature with her elbow until it was just slightly warm. She filled a small bowl and began gently warming the baby's hands and feet. "Is she going to be okay?" Lisa asked, her voice breaking with fear. "She's going to be fine," Betty said with more confidence than she felt. The baby was starting to respond to the warmth, moving her tiny fingers and making soft sounds. "Her color is already getting better, see? Her lips aren't as blue as they were." Betty continued to work on baby Rose while keeping an eye on Lisa. The young mother was shivering violently, which was actually a good sign. It meant her body was still trying to warm itself up. Betty brought her hot tea and made her drink it slowly. "Tell me what happened," Betty said gently, as she continued to warm the baby's hands. "How long were you in that car?" "Since this morning," Lisa said through chattering teeth. "Maybe longer. I was driving to my sister's house when the car started making weird noises. Then the heat stopped working and then it just died completely. I tried to call for help, but my phone had no signal." "Where were you trying to go?" Lisa hesitated. "My sister lives in the next state. I was hoping she would let me and Rose stay with her for a while. Things got bad at home, really bad. I packed up everything I could fit in the car and left." Betty didn't push for more details. She had heard enough stories like this during her years as a nurse to fill in the blanks. A young mother with a baby, leaving in the middle of winter with nothing but what they could carry. It usually meant they were running from something dangerous. "Well, you're safe now," Betty said simply. "Both of you are safe." As the evening wore on, baby Rose began to perk up. Her color returned to normal and she started making the little baby sounds that meant she was feeling better. Lisa's shivering gradually stopped and some warmth came back to her cheeks. "I don't know how to thank you," Lisa said as Betty heated up some soup for dinner. "If you hadn't found us—" "You don't need to thank me," Betty replied. "Anyone would have done the same thing." "No, they wouldn't have," Lisa said quietly. "Most people would have stayed inside where it was warm and safe. You came out in that storm to look for strangers." Betty set a bowl of soup in front of Lisa and sat down, across from her. "You know, I was a nurse for 30 years. I saw a lot of people come through those hospital doors who needed help. Some of them were people I knew, some were complete strangers. But every single one of them mattered. That's just how I was raised." As if on cue, the lights flickered and went out. Betty wasn't surprised. The power always went out during bad storms. She lit some candles and started the generator, which brought the essential lights and heat back on. "How long do storms like this usually last?" Lisa asked, bouncing Rose gently on her lap. "Could be a day or two, could be a week," Betty said honestly. "Depends on how Mother Nature is feeling. But don't worry, I've got enough food and supplies to last a month if we need to." That night, Betty set up the guest bedroom for Lisa and Rose. She found an old crib in the attic that had belonged to her own children years ago and set it up next to the bed. As she was putting fresh sheets on the mattress, she realized how long it had been since anyone other than family had stayed in this room. "Betty?" Lisa appeared in the doorway holding Rose. "Are you sure this is okay? I mean, you don't even know us. We could be anyone." Betty looked at the young mother holding her baby, both of them looking healthier and warmer than they had a few hours ago. "Honey, I've been alone in this house for 3 years. The only sounds I hear most days are the wind and my own voice talking to the cat. Having you both here, well, it's nice to have the house feel alive again. What if the storm lasts a long time? What if we're stuck here for days? Betty smiled. Then I guess we'll get to know each other pretty well, won't we? As Lisa settled into the guest room with baby Rose, Betty could hear the soft sounds of a mother humming lullabies to her child. It was a sound she hadn't heard in her house for decades, and it filled her heart with a warmth that had nothing to do with the fireplace downstairs. Outside, the storm continued to rage, but inside the old farmhouse, 3 people who had been strangers that morning were beginning to become something more. None of them knew it yet, but this was the beginning of something that would change all their lives forever. The storm had been over for 3 days now, and Betty found herself making breakfast for 3 people instead of 1. It was a strange feeling, but not an unwelcome one. The young mother, Lisa, sat at the kitchen table feeding baby Rose while Betty scrambled eggs at the stove. The morning sun streamed through the windows, making everything feel warm and peaceful. "You really don't have to do all this," Lisa said for the 10th time that morning. "We can figure something out. Maybe there's a shelter in town or something." Betty turned around with the pan of eggs in her hand. "Nonsense. Besides, where exactly would you go? That car of yours isn't going anywhere soon." They both looked out the window at Lisa's Honda, which was still buried under 3 feet of snow in Betty's back field. The tow truck driver had already told them it would be at least a week before they could even get to it, and that was assuming the engine hadn't been damaged by the cold. Lisa shifted baby Rose to her other arm and sighed. "I know, but I can't just stay here forever. You've already done so much for us." Betty set the plate of eggs on the table and sat down across from Lisa. Over the past few days, she had learned bits and pieces of Lisa's story. The young woman was 22, had been living with Rose's father until things got bad, really bad. She had packed up one night while he was at work and started driving toward her sister's place in the next state. That's when her car broke down in the middle of the worst storm in decades. "Tell me about this sister of yours," Betty said gently. "Have you talked to her lately?" Lisa looked down at her coffee cup. "Well, not exactly. We haven't spoken in almost 2 years. She didn't approve of Jake, Rose's father. When I moved in with him, she said I was making a huge mistake. We had this big fight and then we just stopped talking." "So you were driving to see someone who doesn't know you're coming?" "I know it sounds stupid," Lisa said, her voice getting smaller. "But I didn't know where else to go. I thought maybe if she saw Rose, if she knew I was trying to do the right thing now." Betty reached across the table and patted Lisa's hand. "It doesn't sound stupid at all, honey. It sounds like you were doing the best you could with what you had." Baby Rose started to fuss, and Lisa stood up to bounce her gently. Betty watched the young mother with Rose and felt something she hadn't experienced in years. The house felt alive again. There were sounds other than the TV and the wind outside. There was laughter when Rose would grab at Lisa's hair, crying when she was hungry, and the soft sounds of a mother singing lullabies late at night. "What did you do before Rose was born?" Betty asked. "I have a degree in early childhood education," Lisa said, looking a little embarrassed. I know. I should have been smarter about getting into that situation with Jake. But I loved him and I thought things would get better after Rose came along." Betty's eyebrows went up. "You're a teacher?" "Well, I was going to be. I finished my degree right before Rose was born, but then Jake didn't want me working. He said mothers should stay home with their babies. At first I thought it was sweet that he wanted to take care of us, but then it became this control thing. He wouldn't let me apply for jobs, wouldn't let me have my own bank account. He said I didn't need to worry about those things." Betty felt a familiar anger building in her chest. In her 30 years as a nurse, she had seen too many women come into the emergency room with stories just like Lisa's. "That's not love, sweetheart, that's control." "I know that now," Lisa said quietly. "It took me way too long to figure it out, but I finally did." They spent the morning cleaning up the breakfast dishes together, and Betty noticed how naturally Lisa helped around the house. She didn't wait to be asked to do things. She just saw what needed doing and did it. When baby Rose went down for her nap, Lisa started wiping down the kitchen counters and organizing the spice rack. "You don't have to do that," Betty said. "I want to help. Besides, I like staying busy. It keeps my mind off things." That afternoon, while Rose napped in the portable crib Betty had borrowed from her neighbor, the two women sat in the living room with cups of tea. Lisa had found a loose board on the back porch and had spent an hour fixing it with tools from Betty's garage. "You're pretty handy with those tools," Betty observed. Lisa smiled. "My dad taught me when I was little. He always said girls should know how to fix things just as much as boys should. Jake hated that I knew how to do that stuff. He said it made him feel useless." "Sounds like Jake had a lot of problems with you being capable." "Yeah, well, Jake had a lot of problems in general." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the baby monitor and watching the snow melt outside the windows. Betty found herself thinking about how different the house felt with Lisa and Rose there. It wasn't just that it was less quiet. It was that she had a purpose again. She had someone to take care of, someone to cook for, someone to worry about. "Betty," Lisa said suddenly, "can I ask you something?" "Of course. Don't take this the wrong way, but why are you being so nice to us? I mean, you don't even know us. We could be anybody." Betty considered the question seriously. "You know, when Tom was sick, people in this community came together to help us in ways I never expected. Neighbors brought food, friends sat with him when I had to run errands, and the whole town pitched in to help with the medical expenses. I learned that sometimes people help each other not because they have to, but because that's what people do. But this is different. We're strangers. Are you, though? You've been in my house for 3 days. I've watched you with your baby. I've seen how gentle you are, how hard you try to help out even when you're exhausted. I may not know your whole story, but I know enough about you to know you're good people." Lisa's eyes filled with tears. "I just don't want to be a burden." "Honey, you're not a burden. If anything, you've been a blessing. This house has been too quiet for too long." That evening, after dinner, Lisa was washing dishes while Betty dried them. Rose was in her bouncy seat on the kitchen floor, making happy baby noises at the ceiling fan. "Betty," Lisa said, without looking up from the sink, "what if I stayed a little longer? Just until I figure out what to do next. I could help around the house, maybe pay you some rent once I find work." Betty felt her heart skip a beat. "Are you sure? What about your sister?" "I've been thinking about that. Maybe it's time I stopped running toward people who don't want me and started building something with people who do." Betty put down the dish towel and looked at Lisa seriously. "Are you saying what I think you're saying?" "I'm saying, maybe this is where I'm supposed to be. Maybe that storm didn't bring me here by accident." Betty felt tears prick at her eyes as she looked at Lisa and baby Rose. For the first time in 3 years, her house felt like a home again. "I'd like that very much," she said. "I'd like that more than you know." Spring had arrived in Montana, and with it came changes that neither Betty nor Lisa had expected. The snow had melted away, revealing a world that looked fresh and new. Lisa had been living at the farmhouse for 3 months now, and what had started as a temporary arrangement had grown into something that felt like family. Lisa sat at Betty's kitchen table with the local newspaper spread out in front of her, circling job advertisements with a red pen. Baby Rose was crawling around the living room, babbling happily as she explored every corner of the house that had become her home. "Look at this one," Lisa said, pointing to an ad in the paper. "Pine Ridge Elementary is looking for a kindergarten teacher. They need someone who can start in the fall." Betty looked up from her morning coffee. "That's the school about 20 minutes from here. Mrs. Johnson's granddaughter goes there. She says it's a good school." "I'm nervous about applying," Lisa admitted. "It's been so long since I used my teaching degree. What if they don't think I'm qualified enough?" "Are you kidding me?" Betty laughed. "You've been teaching Rose new things every single day. Just yesterday you had her clapping her hands and saying Mama clear as day. Besides, you graduated at the top of your class, didn't you?" Lisa smiled. "Well, yeah, but that feels like a lifetime ago." "It was only 2 years ago, sweetheart. You're still the same smart, capable woman who earned that degree." Over the past few months, Betty had watched Lisa grow more confident. The scared, uncertain young woman who had arrived during the blizzard was slowly being replaced by someone stronger, Lisa had taken over most of the cooking and had even started a small vegetable garden behind the house. She fixed things around the farm that had been broken for months, and she had a way with the animals that reminded Betty of Tom. You know what? Lisa said, folding the newspaper. I'm going to apply. The worst they can say is no, right? That's my girl, Betty said proudly. While Lisa was upstairs getting ready to drive into town to submit her application, Betty sat on the front porch watching Rose play with wooden blocks on a blanket. The baby had grown so much since that terrible night in the snowstorm. She was crawling everywhere now, pulling herself up on furniture, and had the biggest smile Betty had ever seen. The phone rang, and Betty went inside to answer it. It was her daughter calling from California. Mom, how are things going with your house guests? Amy asked. Betty had told her children about Lisa and Rose, but she hadn't gone into all the details. They're doing great. Lisa applied for a teaching job today. That's nice, Mom, but don't you think it's time they found their own place? I mean, it's been 3 months. Betty felt a familiar tightness in her chest. Actually, Amy, we've been talking about making this arrangement more permanent. There was silence on the other end of the phone. Mom, you barely know these people. What if they're taking advantage of you? What if this Lisa person is just using you for free housing? She's not using me, Betty said firmly. She pays me rent. She helps around the house and she's become like family to me. But Mom, you're getting older. What if something happens and you need help? What if they just disappear one day and leave you alone again? After Betty hung up the phone, she felt unsettled. Her children meant well, but they didn't understand what her life had been like before Lisa and Rose arrived. They didn't know how quiet and empty the house had felt, or how much joy it brought her to hear baby laughter echoing through the rooms again. When Lisa returned from town that afternoon, she was practically glowing with excitement. They want to interview me next week, she announced. The principal seemed really interested in my background and they're desperate for someone who specializes in early childhood development. Betty hugged her tightly. I'm so proud of you. There's something else, Lisa said, her voice getting more serious. The principal mentioned that the community really needs a good daycare center. A lot of parents drive almost an hour to the nearest one because there's nothing closer. That's too bad for those families, Betty said. Well, I was thinking, Lisa hesitated. What if we did something about it? Betty raised her eyebrows. What do you mean? I mean, what if we started our own daycare center? This house is huge, and with your medical background and my education degree, we'd make a great team. We could convert some of the rooms, create a safe outdoor play area, and provide something this community really needs. Betty stared at Lisa for a long moment. The idea was exciting, but it was also terrifying. That's a big undertaking, honey. Are you sure you'd want to tie yourself down to something like that? Betty, this place has become home to me. You've become family to me. I can't imagine being anywhere else. They spent the evening talking about the possibilities. Betty found herself getting more excited as they discussed the details. The large living room could be converted into a main play area. The extra bedrooms upstairs could be nap rooms. The big backyard was perfect for outdoor activities. We'd have to get licensed, Betty said. There would be inspections, background checks, all sorts of paperwork. I know, Lisa said, but I think we can do it. I really think we can make this work. A week later, Lisa's interview went better than either of them had hoped. The principal offered her the job on the spot, but Lisa surprised everyone by asking if she could think about it over the weekend. Why would you need to think about it? Betty asked when Lisa told her. This is what you wanted. Because I keep thinking about the daycare idea, Lisa said. What if that's what I'm really supposed to be doing? What if instead of working for someone else, I'm supposed to be building something of my own? Something of ours? That weekend, they made lists of everything they would need to start a daycare center. They researched licensing requirements and visited other daycare centers in nearby towns to get ideas. Betty felt more energized than she had in years. On Monday morning, Lisa called the school to respectfully decline the teaching position. That afternoon, they drove to the county office to pick up the paperwork needed to apply for a daycare license. Are you sure about this? Betty asked as they sat in the car outside the government building. This is going to change everything. Lisa looked at her seriously. Betty, 3 months ago I was lost in a snowstorm with nowhere to go and no idea how I was going to take care of my baby. You saved my life. But more than that, you gave me a home and a family. Now I want to build something. With you. I want to create a place where other people can feel safe and cared for, the way you made us feel. Betty felt tears in her eyes. You know, Tom always said this old house was too big for just 2 people. Maybe he knew someday it would need to hold more love than that. They walked into the county office together, ready to start the next chapter of their unexpected journey. As they filled out the paperwork, baby Rose crawled around their feet, babbling happily and clapping her hands. She had no idea that her mother and the woman who had become her grandmother were about to build something beautiful together, but somehow her joy seemed to bless their new beginning anyway. The future felt bright and full of possibilities, even though they both knew the real challenges were just beginning. 6 months had passed since Betty and Lisa submitted their daycare application, and the old farmhouse was buzzing with activity. Workers had spent weeks converting rooms, installing safety features, and creating the perfect environment for children. The large living room now had colorful mats on the floor and low shelves filled with toys and books. The back porch had been enclosed to create a sunny play area, and the yard featured new playground equipment that sparkled in the morning sun. Betty stood in what used to be her formal dining room, now transformed into a cozy reading nook with tiny chairs and a bookshelf filled with picture books. She couldn't believe how different her house looked, but more importantly, how different it felt. This wasn't just her quiet retirement home anymore. It was about to become a place where families could feel safe leaving their most precious treasures. The final inspection is tomorrow, Lisa said, walking into the room with baby Rose on her hip. At 15 months old, Rose was walking everywhere now and had become the unofficial quality tester for all their new equipment. Are you nervous? Betty asked. Terrified, Lisa laughed. But the good kind of terrified. Like when you're about to go on a roller coaster that you've been waiting in line for all day. They had spent months preparing for this moment. The licensing process had been more complicated than either of them expected, with background checks, health inspections, fire safety reviews, and mountains of paperwork. But they had passed every requirement, and tomorrow's final inspection was the last step before they could officially open Sunshine Haven Daycare. That evening, as they were putting the finishing touches on the infant room, Lisa's phone rang. Betty saw her face go pale as she looked at the caller ID. It's him, Lisa whispered. It's Jake. Betty felt her stomach drop. Jake was Rose's father, the man Lisa had fled from during that terrible snowstorm over a year ago. They hadn't heard from him since Lisa left, and Betty had hoped they never would. Don't answer it, Betty said quickly, but Lisa was already swiping to accept the call. Hello, Jake. Betty could hear his voice through the phone, angry and demanding. She couldn't make out all the words, but his tone made her blood run cold. Lisa's hands started shaking as she held the phone to her ear. No, Jake. You can't see. Her, Lisa said, her voice getting stronger. We've been through this. You lost that right when you chose drinking over being a father. The voice on the other end got louder, and Betty could hear him threatening to take Lisa to court, claiming he had rights as Rose's father. Lisa looked like she might collapse. Betty gently took the phone from Lisa's hands. This is Betty, and I think this conversation is over. Who the hell are you? Jake's voice came through the speaker. I'm the person who's going to hang up this phone and call the police if you keep harassing this family, Betty said calmly. Lisa and Rose are safe here, and they're going to stay that way. She ended the call and immediately turned off Lisa's phone. Lisa was sitting on the floor now, holding Rose tightly while tears streamed down her face. He found us, Lisa whispered. I don't know how, but he found us. Betty sat down next to them on the floor. It's going to be okay. We're not going to let him hurt you or Rose. You don't understand, Lisa said, her voice shaking. He's mean when he's been drinking, but he's smart when he's sober. He knows how to work the system. What if he really does take me to court? What if he gets custody? Betty thought about this for a moment. Over the past year, she had watched Lisa transform from a scared young woman into a confident mother and business partner. She had seen Lisa wake up every morning with purpose, dedicating herself to creating a better life for her daughter. The idea of Jake disrupting that made her furious. "Then we'll fight back," Betty said simply. "We'll get a lawyer, we'll document everything, and we'll show any judge in the country what kind of life you've built for Rose here." The next morning, despite the stress of Jake's phone call, the final inspection went perfectly. The state inspector was impressed with their facilities, their safety procedures, and their educational programming. When she handed them their official license, Betty and Lisa both started crying. "Congratulations," the inspector said with a smile. "You should be very proud of what you've built here." That afternoon, they celebrated by taking Rose to the park in town. As they pushed her on the swings, Lisa seemed more relaxed than she had since Jake's phone call. "You know," Lisa said, "I keep thinking about something you said last night. About fighting back. What about it? For so long I just tried to stay out of Jake's way, tried not to make him angry. But I'm not that person anymore. This place we've built, this life we have here, it's worth fighting for." Betty smiled. "Yes, it is. I want to call a lawyer tomorrow. I want to make sure that Jake can never take Rose away from the home we've made for her." 3 weeks later, Sunshine Haven Daycare welcomed its first group of children. Betty and Lisa had decided to start small, with just 8 kids ranging from 6 months to 4 years old. The house filled with the sounds of children playing, laughing, and learning. Betty found herself in her element, using her medical background to comfort, scraped knees, and check for fevers, while Lisa created educational activities that had the kids excited about learning. They made a perfect team, just like they had hoped. One morning, while the children were having snack time, Sheriff Martinez stopped by for a visit. Lisa tensed up when she saw his patrol car, but Betty squeezed her hand reassuringly. "Just wanted to check in and see how things are going," he said, accepting a cup of coffee from Betty. "I heard through the grapevine that you might have had some unwanted contact recently." Lisa had filed a restraining order against Jake with the sheriff's help the week before. "He called once, but we haven't heard from him since." "Good. I want you to know that this community looks out for its own. If he shows up here causing trouble, he'll have a lot more to worry about than just me." After the sheriff left, Betty and Lisa stood in their kitchen watching the children play in the backyard. Rose was toddling around with the other kids, giggling, as she chased soap bubbles that Lisa had blown for them. "You know what I realized today?" Lisa said. "What's that?" "A year and a half ago, I was lost in a snowstorm with nowhere to go. I thought my life was over. But that storm didn't end my story. It brought me to the beginning of my real story." Betty felt tears in her eyes as she watched Rose playing with the other children. And what a beautiful story it's turning out to be. I know it sounds crazy, but sometimes I'm grateful for that storm. If it hadn't happened, I never would have found you. Rose never would have had a grandmother who loves her so much. And all these kids wouldn't have this safe, happy place to come every day. Betty put her arm around Lisa's shoulders. "You know what your husband Tom used to say? He said that sometimes the worst storms bring the most beautiful rainbows." As if on cue, Rose ran up to them with her arms outstretched, and both women bent down to scoop her up in a group hug. Outside, the children's laughter filled the air, and the farmhouse that had once been too quiet now hummed with the energy of love, purpose, and family that had been found in the most unexpected way.